Thank you for watching my presentation today. So my presentation, I was very interested in genetically modified foods, and I thought it would be a really fun idea to investigate into that a little bit further since I know the technology is relatively new. It's only been around about maybe like 20, 25 years. So I thought it would be cool to investigate that today. So my research project was on if GM foods are safe. And just to start here, I wanted to explain what GM foods are for people who may not be familiar. GM foods are genetically modified foods or organisms within agriculture that have been modified using genetic engineering to produce a desired trait. One example of that would be like if you have a corn that you wanted to make resistant to insects or infections. These traits have benefits in mass production. Some common uses regarding genetically modified foods include resistance to disease, infection, and control of nutrition values. Many foods that can be purchased today are genetically modified counterparts of their selves. So we do consume, especially in America, we do consume genetically modified foods, and they're not really labeled. There's no process for that. So you may be eating GM foods and not even knowing it. Some goals with my paper. The main objective of my paper was to figure out if these GM foods carried any long-term effects. Again, this is sort of like a really, really new technology. So I just wanted to like look and see if there are any studies or anything that could determine if there were long-term effects of eating these foods, and just kind of I wanted to see how these foods were regulated. So I thought that was really interesting too with such a new type of food that is genetically modified. I wanted to see how it was regulated. And then finally, I wanted to see what types of studies had been done on these foods, not with just long-term effects, but if there are any negative effects, period, from eating these foods, since they're not natural. And to jump into that, what is selective breeding? Selective breeding is the process through which parents with certain traits are bred together to provide offspring with the same traits. That's sort of what we used before genetic engineering. Um, Humans started out as hunters and gatherers, and then we sort of moved into the more agriculture, and we started using selective breeding. There are downsides to this method. It takes a really long time. Each change occurs with each iteration, and it can just take a really long time to see the actual trait that you want to come out as you keep breeding these two organisms together. And then another downside is with each iteration, the diversity of genes becomes less and less. So, every time you breed, these organisms become more similar. So the diversity is totally gone. And then organisms that are bred this way are so similar that they're susceptible to the same diseases and often the same weaknesses. So, if you have a corn that's really susceptible to one infection, if they're bred with selective breeding, all the other corns that are bred that same way will be susceptible too. So yeah, they do have the same strengths, but they also have the same weaknesses. What did I find out? Now that we know the background of what this is about, I just want to explain what I found out in my research. So this technology is still relatively new. The first GM foods hit the market in the late 90s, so there are not a lot of long-term studies since it hasn't been around that long, and it just doesn't seem like there have been that many long-term studies. There have been studies, though. There have been about 900 studies conducted in the last 20 or so years, and they all didn't really find a correlation between any long-term effects or safety issues in regards to GM foods, so that's good. Another thing would be that we would be seeing the long-term effects by now if there were any. These foods have been around since the late 90s, so we've been consuming them, and we would be able to see the effects if there were any. And then the last is the FDA has many strict guidelines for productions of GM foods. One is the Plant Biotechnology Consultant Program, and with that, manufacturers of these GM foods have to submit a safety data sheet to the FDA, and the food actually has to be reviewed by the FDA before it can be approved to be sold in stores. So even though these things aren't like clearly labeled in some instances, there's still a lot of regulation. So personally, I don't feel that there's any risk. I mean, I do feel as time progresses, there are going to be more long-term studies, which will show that these foods are safe and kind of get people's, I guess, trust more. Since this is kind of weird, we're literally injecting a trait into a organism and making it do something that it naturally wouldn't do. So I totally can see like the hesitancy of doing this. But from my research, I do see that it is pretty safe, and if it wasn't, it definitely these foods definitely wouldn't still be on the market. So anyway, thank you so much for watching my presentation.